Hello, good morning, everybody. Karen and Lisa, I want to start by thanking you both for accepting the invitation to participate in this table about the book that you organized. Karen Detlefsen is Vice Provost for Education and Professor of Philosophy and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She's editor of Descartes' Meditations, A Critical Guide, 2013, and co-editor with Jacqueline Broad of Women and Liberty, Philosophical Essays, 2017. Lisa Shapiro is professor of philosophy and dean of arts at McGill University. From 2002 to 2022, she was professor in the Department of Philosophy at Simon Fraser University. She's translator and editor of the Correspondence of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and René Descartes, 2007, co-editor of Emotions and Cognitive Life in Medieval and Early Modern Philosophy, and co-editor of Modern Philosophy and Ontology. Sarah Bonfim is also with us here today. Sarah is a PhD student here at Unicamp, State University of Campinas, and she investigates the work of Mary Wollstonecraft. She's online because she's doing a research internship at Cambridge University this semester, and she's the author of the chapter on Mary Wollstonecraft that will be published later this year, I hope in 2024, in the Encyclopedia of Women Philosophers, organized by me, Carolina Araújo, and Alina Leal. Karen and Lisa are also co-investigators of Extending New Narratives, a project engaged in retrieving philosophical works of women and individuals from other marginalized groups and sustaining the presence of this figure in the history of philosophy. I need to say that the overall goal of Extending New Narratives, which is to help change the standards of practice in philosophy to enable it to become more inclusive and diverse, this goal is being achieved here in Brazil. And because, I have to say, largely because of your efforts, Lisa and Karen. Today, we are here at Unicamp, gated by the fourth Vozes, Women at Philosophy, or quarta Vozes, Mulheres na Filosofia, precisely to retell the history of philosophy. This 4-day event, we started on Monday and will continue to tomorrow. This event is welcoming 56 researchers from the 5 regions of this big country, Brazil, to share the results of their research on women philosophers from antiquity to medieval ages, modernity, and contemporary times. And I have to say that here we have a special attention on the works of Black Brazilian women philosophers. So that's it, what I would like to say, that this goal, the goal of the New Narratives Project is being achieved here in Brazil largely because of your efforts. So I have to say one more thing. It's important for us to say that, to thank you for encouraging us to defy the standards and the sacred canon, to use Lisa's word. Through different means, women have sought throughout history to defy the standards that despise them intellectually, and we want people to know this in the field of philosophy. That's why we are here. That's why I invited you to be here with us today to talk about the book you organized, the Routledge Handbook of Women and Early Modern European Philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to thank the organizers, thank the audience for coming, and then pass things over to Lisa. She and I are going to go back and forth. So really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Lisa and I are both in administration, so our opportunities to engage with philosophy are very far and few between, and I am so grateful for this opportunity to go back to my intellectual home. I also want to thank you for allowing me to speak in English as the language I'm most comfortable in. So many appreciation for that. I'm going to pass it over to Lisa, who's going to do the first part of the presentation.
So let me just reiterate Karen's thanks for the invitation. And I know this was originally planned for the fall, and I'm so glad that you were able to reorganize and reschedule things to make it happen and to accommodate Karen's and my jam-packed schedules, really, and I can only just reiterate how much of a pleasure it is for me as well to have a dedicated hour and a half to philosophy. It's a rare treat. So thanks so much. And I also just want to note, because Karen is really, I think, too modest to say this herself, but the idea for this volume started with Karen and her ambitious aims to pull together this really amazing resource. And I came along for the ride, and quite a ride it was, with COVID interrupting our plans to have this come together more quickly. But we were so delighted that it appeared last year, finally. The amount of work of not only of the authors, but research assistants and RA and of course us. But yeah, so it's been a road. But Karen deserves the credit for the idea itself. So it's kind of amazing, I think, the idea behind this when it first emerged, which feels like an eternity ago. I think it was 2018 that the idea for this volume first emerged. It felt like the study of early modern women philosophers, while it had been around, was still a relatively new area, and research was tending to gravitate towards a select few figures, usually writing in English. In particular, and so one of the aims of the volume was to really help help to avoid the entrenchment of another canon of women philosophers to parallel a canon of male philosophers, and to draw attention to the sheer numbers of women who were working philosophically in the early modern period. On this end, the volume's divided into two distinct kinds of parts. One is a set of chapters that are thematically organized, and with each chapter focusing on at least two women on that theme to highlight some themes that are familiar, but also other themes that are less familiar. And then the second half of the volume is devoted to chapters dedicated to individual female philosophers. And so to go more in depth into the work of a female philosopher than perhaps the thematic chapters are able to because of their scope. Just to note that for some women, figures in the either thematically or in the chapter dedicated, the paper published in the volume is the first one published on that figure. I think that's kind of remarkable. I don't think, while there's quite a lot of work in literature on Phyllis Wheatley, for example, I don't think there's a philosophical article on Phyllis Wheatley. And there's, the kind of not highlighting the lists. We can talk about that in the Q&A if needed. The other thing to note is not just the focus of the chapters themselves, but the authors of the chapters. And we were quite intentional in selecting authors. Of course, we wanted to select some established researchers, but we were also trying to bring established researchers into the project of recovering the philosophical work of women. And so for some authors, the names that I'll just highlight here are Alison Simmons and Marlene Rosemond, really great historians of philosophy who had not written themselves on any woman philosopher of the past, and worked together on their chapter, and are now working more on women philosophers and teaching women philosophers more centrally in their courses. So expanding the scope of people focusing on this research area. And then we also wanted to invite the next generation of researchers to contribute to the volume, because again, to provide an incentive for them to get a publication, working in a good publication, I should add, in an area that isn't always legitimate, but also to really encourage the continuing movement of the discipline of the history of philosophy in this direction to the next generation of scholars. And of course, we also included people who had been working on women philosophers for quite some time, not only Karen and myself, but people like Marcy Lascano and Sarah Hutton and others who bring their expertise to the volume. And really, if you think about this, the volume itself represents a community of researchers of different expertise and different stages of career, and that was an intentional goal of the volume. That was furthered, was supposed to happen through a conference that was scheduled for March 2020, but we were able to get together in the spring of 22 to have people actually meet each other in person again. And with that, I will maybe turn it over to Karen now to talk a bit about other dimensions of the volume itself.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the audience, but also in some senses our broader purpose with the volume, or one broader purpose with the volume, which dates back to some intentional thinking we did now, I think a decade ago. So the audience, we were asked by the press to put together a handbook that had sort of survey articles, introductory articles, in order to make it widely available to a community, including a community of students, undergraduates and graduate students. This topic is really interesting in that so many of the philosophers that we're looking at, and so many of the ways in which those philosophers look at topics in the early modern period are new, such that we could get at one and the same time an introduction to a topic, but also a cutting edge original piece of work. Simply because the piece of work would often be the first thing written on an individual, or the first thing written on the way in which people are thinking about, for example, education in the early modern period from a what we might think of as a feminist lens. So we were able, I think, to get both a volume that had good survey of the period, good introduction to the period, but also provide papers that would be, for those of us who have been working in this area for a long time, would be new and exciting philosophical material. So in the end, we actually aimed for, and I hope we are able to reach a broad audience. Indeed, students coming to this for the first time, advanced undergraduates and graduate students, but also seasoned philosophers, and seasoned philosophers who, like Lisa, Marcy, Sarah, and others, Jackie Broad, and others who have been working in this area, can find new interesting material in the papers. But then also seasoned philosophers who maybe haven't thought about early modern European women before, and want to expand their understanding of our discipline to include those folks. I think also, and this is I think work moving forward, making connections or making more connections with people in other fields, scholars in other fields, so scholars in literary theory, history of science, and the like. I think that will be, I hope that this volume can connect with the work that many of those people are doing. But I also think as we move forward, being really intentional in developing those connections will be really helpful for the work itself. Engaging with colleagues across disciplines, I think will help us enrich in our understanding of the work of these women going forward. And in some sense, we had that a little bit, I think, in the back of our minds. Indeed, we have a historian as one of the authors of the volume, and bringing folks into the project of extent of the New Narratives Project or the Recovery Project, I think will be sort of maybe one of the next steps that we'll take. So that's broadly how we were thinking about audience. About 10 years ago, as I say, I think it was 2014 or maybe 2015, a group of us gathered in a small study room in the library at the University of Pennsylvania to think, where do we go from here? Lisa was one of those folks, and Marguerite Delaurier, Andrew Janiak, and a few others. And we were thinking about how we move into the future with a project that was being undertaken by hardy souls in various spots. Sarah Hutton had been working tirelessly on recovering women's voices right from the beginning, in some senses, at the vanguard of that. Eileen O'Neill as well. And I think there were a couple of things that we were thinking needed to happen. One was that we needed to really connect across the globe and really develop networks and communities in order to benefit from the work that we were doing, and also in order to help each other with the work that we were doing, including on very, very very pragmatic ways, like how do we write tenure letters for people who are doing this kind of work in order to make sure that people who are working outside of the sort of the core of early modern philosophy can continue this work as junior faculty and onwards. But there was also, at least for me, there was a real fear that the work would die in some senses in the future, that if there weren't enough people working in this area, that the flurry of writing that was happening might just fade away when those of us working in this area might retire. And so what we thought is we need to change the discipline really fundamentally. And the way to change the discipline really fundamentally is to raise the next generation from undergraduate on up with an understanding that philosophy is a broad church and includes lots of folks doing philosophy. And to do that, we needed to change teaching methods. And this volume is, as well as what I often think of as the companion volume that Lisa and Marcia Lascano put together 2-3 years before this one, the volume of primary text that includes many philosophers beyond the traditional canon. this pair of volumes is meant to help with that teaching mission. It's meant to help people design syllabi from their first year undergraduate students on up, and even into the high school for places where there are high school projects in philosophy, such that students who come to philosophy for the first time come to it with an understanding that it's not just a man's game. It's not just a European man's game. They just don't have to overcome the narrow canon that many of us who were raised on an earlier philosophical diet have had to overcome. So that's a goal of this, in order to make this project stick, and to sort of bring the project into the core of how we think about philosophy. So that's sort of some background on the nature and the purpose of the volume. Lisa and I are now going to turn to talk a little bit about content, and we're going to do that in sort of what I think of as two passes. The first pass, we just want to talk through the title and talk through 4 features of the title to give you kind of a broad strokes understanding of the volume or the framing of the volume. And then in the second pass, Lisa and I will talk through our own contributions to the volume, just hitting on a couple of really crucial high points and connecting that with a few other papers. So the title of the volume, as you know, is the Routledge Handbook of Women and Early Modern European Philosophy. And we're going to talk about 4 aspects of that title. Early modern, European is the second, third, women, and fourth, philosophy. So I'm going to kick off by talking about early modern and the meaning of that and the limits of that. And then I'll pass it on to Lisa for the next bit. So we roughly take the early modern period in this volume to be from about 1560 to 1780 of the Common Era. So the bookends you might think of as being Montaigne on the one hand, and Kant on the other hand. It is true that some of the authors some of the philosophers in the volume fall outside of those bookends, but that was sort of roughly what we took to be the crucial time period. This tracks major scientific events in Europe. It tracks a period that for a long time was called the Scientific Revolution, with folks like Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, and the like. And for a long time, philosophy, as it was taught in colleges and universities, or early modern philosophy as it was taught in colleges and universities, really did connect in with the scientific revolution, or what we think of as as natural philosophy, with a really strong focus on metaphysics and epistemology and how these interact with natural philosophy. But that's just a tiny piece of what was happening in Europe in this time. And literature and history departments tend to focus on other aspects of the historical context in this time as well. So, for example, folks in literature and history think of this period as starting with the Protestant Reformation and ending a little bit earlier than our bookend, in the early 17th century. So there's a real focus there on what we might think of as political and cultural movements. So less about the natural world and more about the human world. And opening up our understanding of philosophy to include the fullness of interests in this period shows us, I think, how much the women in Europe in this period were interested in areas of philosophy that maybe weren't carried forward as quite as central in the way that epistemology and metaphysics were carried forward. So we get, for example, real attention paid to education, to justice, to how to think about what marriage means, etc. And this volume then connects in with some of those more political, social, ethical kinds of movements. But there's another, I think, really important thing to say about that aspect of the title and therefore of the volume, that the early modern period locks in very specifically with European history. The scientific revolution, the events that I just spoke about were events that happened on the European continent. And so this is a periodization that is very, very locked into Europe and events in Europe. And that is that's an important thing to bear in mind with this volume, is that it is squarely located on one continent with, I think, some important caveats to that. And Lisa will talk a little bit about that continental focus in the next bit. Lisa, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. One of the things to note actually is the qualifier European came into the title relatively late in the process, and in finalizing the contract with Routledge, the publisher, we had to advocate for including European in the title, and the publisher agreed. But I think that also goes to show just how quickly contextualization is happening. Because 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, it was still very, I think, common to just tacitly assume that the history of philosophy is just the history of all philosophy, when in fact it's the history of European philosophy that we've taken for granted. And I'm involved. I'm on the board of the Journal of the History of Philosophy, and the board's been having discussions about the title of the journal, and the mission statements recently been revised to be cognizant of the history of the title of the journal, and how it's representing something that it actually it's representing itself to be something that isn't actually realized in the articles in the journal, and that's okay, but have to make it explicit. And so really the point of European is to draw attention to an assumption that was heretofore tacit, that the intellectual history and the history of philosophy that through which we understand ourselves, or many of us understand ourselves, has been one that has been squarely focused on Europe. And interestingly, I think from the point of view of the particular time period, it's also a time period in which the Atlantic slave trade started and then developed. And by excluding the geographical context from our own thinking about our intellectual history, we obscure that very important dimension of the social, historical, political context in which the philosophers in which we're interested are engaging in their work. That's not to discount the very central developments in the history of science, but it's also to recognize that those developments in the history of science are aligned with other historical developments around imperialism, around the scientific discoveries that came with traveling to new lands and discovering new natural phenomena and resources, and to then try to take advantage in various ways of those new territories. So a lot's packed into that one simple word, European. And I think that's the intention of including it in the title, not to sort of prefigure what conclusions should be drawn from thinking about the philosophy that has been familiar. as European, but to draw attention to the geographic contingency, as well as the temporal period in which the volume's focused. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen to talk about the women.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. So this is a book about women philosophers, and focusing on women is central to the recovery project that many of us have been involved in. As it turns out, that many of the women that we look at in the volume, maybe many is an overstatement, but some at least, and an increasing number, have become so well treated that we might begin to think of them as being canonized through this treatment. I think of Wollstonecraft as one example. Also Emily du Châtelet, Margaret Cavendish, etc. So there are some folks in the volume, some philosophers in the volume, who have become so familiar to us that we now, I think many of us think of them as having arrived, so to speak. That said, many of the philosophers we treat in the volume are philosophers who are treated for the first time in English. Lisa mentioned this earlier. Some examples of that: Louise Dupin, Frances Reynolds, Marguerite Bouffet, Olivia Subuka, and others as well. First time, to our knowledge, that there's been a philosophy paper written in English on these figures. So that's a really, really important feature of the continued recovery, is expanding our expanding and continuing to find and recover the philosophical work of women who we have ceased to carry forward in our history. That said, there are some departures in the volume from our focus on women. And those departures, there are a number of reasons for it, and I'll talk about just two of those reasons. One is that the women, like the men, are all writing within a context. That is, they're writing within a story or a narrative of philosophy unfolding in this period. And what that means is that they are connecting with the philosophical works of other people, including the philosophical works of men. Much of the philosophy that people across the board produced in this period was philosophy that came to the fore in correspondences with one another. And we get that with many of the women, just like many of the men. So Damaris Masham was in correspondence with Leibniz, Elizabeth in correspondence with Descartes, etc. It's really, really important to focus on the motivations and the context of the women, and take the women as first and foremost, at least in my view, when we're thinking about their work, instead of thinking them in reaction to more famous men, but ignoring the fact that they are interacting with the ideas and the thought of the men just decontextualizes their thinking in ways that I think deprives us of a full understanding of their work. The other thing I want to point out about the occasional exception in the volume, and the occasional exception meaning that we are that some of the papers address men alongside women, is that some men also have fallen by the wayside throughout history. In some cases, like Henry Moore, for example, so there's one paper that looks very closely at the interaction of Henry Moore and Anne Conway's thinking. And so in cases like that, there may be any number of reasons why Moore has fallen by the wayside, but falling by the wayside because of his identity was not one of those reasons. But there are other men who fell by the wayside because of their identity. That is, alongside women, some men have not been taken seriously as epistemic authorities, as people who have something important to say. And the reason for that is not because of what they say, but because of what their identities are. Anton Amo, Ghanaian-born philosopher who spent his philosophical life in Germany before returning to Ghana near the end of his life, is a perfect example of that. And his work is treated very, very fulsomely by Margaret Watkins in her chapter, which also deals with Estelle. I'm going to say a little bit more about Professor Watkins' paper down the road, but that's just a few qualifications to our focus on women. So I'm going to pass it back to Lisa, who's going to talk about the philosophy part of our topic and our title, and then talk a little bit about her paper as well.
This time I'm unmuting myself. Thanks, Karen. So I'm not going to say that much about philosophy, because I think the real bulk of what we have to say about the philosophy part of the title is contained in the two chapters that we're going to be focusing on first. But I think that the thing that I just want to highlight leading into that is that many of us, in part because of the philosophical canon, have preconceptions about what a philosophical work looks like or what it's about. Invariably, we assume that to be a philosophical work, it needs to be a treatise, or needs to be focused on questions of metaphysics and epistemology. And one of the things that attending to women philosophers does is highlight that philosophy is not practiced in any kind of uniform way. And that's true just as much for women as it is for canonical figures, canonical male figures as well. So looking at these women figures helps to draw attention to is these assumptions we make that actually turn out to be unjustified, even with respect to canonical figures. And one of the things that I think I'm going to come back to in a few minutes that I particularly want to highlight, and what's really brought home for me, is philosophy in many ways is we do philosophy at a level of abstraction, right? Part of what it is to be a philosopher is to abstract away from the particular. And insofar as we do that, there's a tendency to try to arrive at universal truths, timeless truths, but that we're trying to arrive at these universal timeless truths does not mean that our investigations, our inquiries, our philosophical inquiries, are removed from the particular time and place in which those inquiries are undertaken. That the philosophical impulse, a concept that I've heard Karen talk about a great deal with respect to her projects on philosophy for children, really is something that each of us is moved to as human beings, but because of the environment in which we find ourselves, we raise these questions about matters that are highly abstract and are very general, but those questions emerge from particular situations and particular issues that the inquirer is facing. And I think we agree that a lot of the canonical history of philosophy has tried, some canonical history of philosophy has tried to address that through the contextualist approaches that situate canonical texts within the history of science. But that's also a kind of abstracted history. The history of science is often abstracted from the social and political context in which those scientific developments are happening. So there's a lot of layers to sort of rediscover and to bring to the surface through the concept of philosophy. So with that title, understanding of the title unpacked a bit, I want to turn just back to the project in many ways is a project of disrupting the canon, the philosophical canon, to changing. There's different ways of thinking about doing that, of changing the canon. And I think it's helpful, for me, it's been helpful to think about what a canon is in the first place. And I think in the chapter in this volume, I suggest that canonical figures have a special authority insofar as they're taken to make progress on a set of philosophical questions that are taken not simply to be central to philosophy, but are actually necessary to philosophy. And what this has done is really foregrounded questions of metaphysics and epistemology as the true philosophical questions in a canon. I think there's been some recent work, increasingly more recent work, that really is, I find fascinating, to tell you the truth, that does this intellectual historical labor to show that canons do not just appear out of nowhere, but that the storyline with the foregrounding of these metaphysical and epistemological questions serves a political purpose. This started with Bruce Kuklick's 1984 article on how the canon came to be part of the curriculum in North America. And recently, more recent works by Delphine Antoine Maheu and Sabrina Ebersmeyer have shown how in France and in Germany, who is included and who's excluded from the canon is connected, if not directly, with political issues, at least indirectly. So in France, it's the development of a national curriculum to serve as the creating of the French Republic. And in Germany, it's a series of generations of intellectual historians that systematically foreground some figures and systematically exclude women at a time when women were arguing for, political to have political status. And so then the question is, given the contingency of the canon, how do we undo what's become entrenched? And I think we can all agree that one big part of it is doxographical, to discover the names of people who have been erased or written out of intellectual history. But of course, just listing names, and I'll just shout out to Eileen O'Neill's seminal article, Disappearing Ink, here, which is a tour de force of showing just how many women have been written out of the history of European philosophy. What do you do with that once you have that bibliography of figures who undertook philosophical work? Well, you've got to figure out what to read and understand what their philosophical positions are. And that's a really daunting task. And I think we can see that there's been different ways of approaching that task. The first way, I think, is way Karen just gestured to in what she was saying about women philosophers, that there are quite a number of women philosophers that corresponded with canonical male philosophers, and it's a pretty straightforward exercise to start reading women in relation to familiar figures and to position them as legitimate philosophers in relation to figures who are familiar. Figures like Elizabeth of Bohemia and her correspondence with Descartes, Damaris Masham corresponding with Locke, Coburn responding to Locke. That's a strategy, but it has an effect that I think is unintentional, but nonetheless real, of subordinating those women to their male correspondents or the figures to whom they're responding. And perhaps in response to that, there's been a second strategy to valorize a subset of women as having great status like a status that of greatness that corresponds to the greatness of the canonical male philosophers. I think we've seen that happening in particular in the early modern period with Margaret Cavendish and with Émilie du Châtelet. It is not to take away from their great achievements to the achievements of Cavendish and du Châtelet to problematize the notion of greatness, however. So I would just say that I think that strategy of focusing on trying to highlight some great female philosophers, that's a strategy that aligns with a way of talking about this problem of undoing the canon as expanding the canon. The problem is the canon it's not a problem with the canon per se, it's that the canon is incomplete. And so we need to find the other great figures to fill out that canon. So what's the problem with focusing on greatness? Well, or trying to identify greatness? Well, we need to ask what makes a philosopher great in the first place. And some answers to that question can simply reinforce the exclusionary structures that have led to the diminishment of these women philosophers' intellectual contributions in various ways. Stephen Hetherington and Karen, in an article in the volume edited by Stephen Hetherington, have tried to reorient, make an effort at reorienting how we think of greatness, and turning it away from just having a great mind and being somehow a genius, to rather what's a measure of greatness is how a thinker enables us to see the world and ourselves in a new way. And that's a very dynamic conception of greatness, I think, because in different times and places, different figures will be more meaningful to some people, and other figures will be more meaningful to other people. So it's a very expansive conception of what a great philosopher could be. And I also think that's a really useful way, that way of thinking about greatness really is about meaningfulness as opposed to having a kind of genius quality, the meaningfulness of the philosophical works. Part of the reason that helps us understand why contributions of women philosophers have been neglected or even erased, it's because the philosophical questions in which they've been interested that were meaningful to them have not been recognized as meaningful questions by the people writing the canonical history of philosophy. That's not to say their questions they're interested are not meaningful. Quite the contrary. When we start to read them and see the questions they're interested in, we can see these women as deeply concerned with understanding and addressing the particular challenges that they are confronting as women within a social context that denigrates their own intellectual capacities, that mocks their social relationships, and that gives them a a limited set of options for structuring their own paths. And those seen in that light, their philosophical investigations, I think, can be much more easily seen as meaningful to us, contemporary, intellectually engaged people with philosophical interests of our own that we bring to bear in our reading of these texts. And that we see this historical context and women engaging with different set of questions in their historical context becomes meaningful to us insofar as we get a new way of understanding the issues, the questions that are of moment to us in this time and place. And I think that that's a general point for a historiography of philosophy, that we need to find a way of writing the history of philosophy that doesn't abstract away from our own particular motivations to philosophize. We're interested in philosophy because we're interested in a set of questions that are important to us for whatever reason, right? and we need to acknowledge our own interest in the questions that we're interested in, and to tell a story of the history of philosophy that is meaningful to us in our time and place, but that recognizes that there's conversations to be had with the writers of the past that can give us insight, real insight, substantial insight into the questions that we're engaging with. And so in this regard, I just want to highlight 3 of the chapters in the volume that I think speak to this way of thinking about the history of philosophy, and in particular about the historical women philosophers that are meaningful. And so start with Kellen Emmett's chapter on marriage and autonomy. In that chapter, Kellen Emmett argues that women's critiques of marriage lay the foundation for the canonical contractarian critiques of political structures that actually started 50 years or so after Moderata Fonte, the author on whom she's most squarely focused, who's writing at the turn of, in 1600, so right at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Worth of Women is the work she's focused on, is a dialogue, well, dialogue's too narrow a term, it's an elaborate conversation of a multi-generational group of women discussing the pros and cons of marriage. And the critiques of marriage that emerge in that conversation center on the ways in which marriage as an institution subjugates and oppresses women, putting them under the arbitrary rule of another rather than their own governance. And so insofar as this discussion of marriage is centered on the heteronomy of decision-making of married women, Emmett situates this conversation within an emerging debate in the early modern period around the importance, the centrality of autonomous decision-making as a condition of selfhood. According to Emmett, these writings not only provide an important history to contemporary feminist debates, which also involve critiques of marriage, but also that they are really making the arguments that contractarians, writing again just starting 50 years later, make similar criticisms of monarchical and other tyrannical forms of government. But interestingly, as Emmett points out, most of these contractarians not only are unwilling to recognize the critiques of marriage that prefigure their arguments by erasing them from intellectual history, they just don't acknowledge that these discussions of marriage were present. They're also unwilling to recognize that the critiques they're making of forms of government also apply to marriage. So Locke and Rousseau assert that marriage naturally and essentially has a hierarchical structure. So they explicitly bracket marriage from the critiques they're offering. Uncovering philosophical writings on marriage thus shed new light not only on the history of feminism, and in particular works like the seminal work of Carol Patement to contemporary feminist philosophy, but also on the history and tensions within canonical political philosophy. So it's, I think, rich on 2 fronts in that regard. Michaela Manson's chapter on 17th century women's writings on philosophy of education examines 4 figures. So another topic that emerges looking at women is education, and the 4 figures Manson focuses on, Anna Maria von Scherman, Jacqueline Pascal, Madame de Maintenon, Mary Estelle, highlight the richness of the philosophical questions around education. To list a number of the themes that Manson highlights, whether education ought to aim at moral and or intellectual improvement, what these 2 kinds of improvement consist in and how they relate to each other, including whether education ought to aim at promoting a particular relation to the divine, or whether the ends of education ought to be construed in more secular terms, the possibility and the value of self-tuition or autodidacticism versus the benefits of institutional and educational settings. As Manson highlights, while these philosophical questions may have fallen out of fashion, they resonate with contemporary concerns in a way that make these and other women concerned with education compelling for us to read and consider in informing contemporary discussion. And I've just been really struck by just how consistent this concern with education is to women thinkers of the past. And I'll just highlight, I know there's been a lot of recent attention in Brazil to Nícia Floresta. Her 19th century concerns with education really are continuing many of these same themes, but bringing them into a different temporal and socio-historical context. And that's a really, I think, interesting, there's lots of interesting things to say about this thematic eternal recurrence that seems to be on display. And I think the last chapter I want to highlight is just Erin Garrett's chapter on Phyllis Wheatley, which is going to set up what Karen has to say nicely, I think, as well, because Wheatley wrote exclusively, there's some correspondence, but her writings are exclusively poetry. And she herself does not describe herself as a philosopher. But Garrett argues that her poetry is particularly meaningful as she was a formerly enslaved person who, Garrett wants to argue, constitutes herself as a human being through her poetry, through two key elements. First, the importance of a particular affective attitude towards the world, one of wonder and openness to a manifest divine grace, and equally to the centrality of an individual human being's worth. For Garrett, on Garrett's reading of Wheatley, each of these points are established through stylistic considerations. Her writing in the first person, and all her poetry is in the first person, asserts her own authority as a human being, which makes a particularly salient moral point, given that she had been enslaved. That she writes in the first person it always has significance, but in her case has particular significance. And then further, her choice of poetry as a genre has a particular efficacy in affording the affective attitude that she's trying to argue for in her readers in a way that discursive assertions might not be as successful in doing. So Garrett's argument is that writing using a different genre allows Wheatley to effectively challenge dominant philosophical discourse in her own time. And that leads, I think, perfectly to what Karen is going to be talking about next. So I'll turn it over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Lisa. You're right. It does connect with what I want to talk about with respect to genre and method, which is what my paper is on. And it also connects in with that term in the title that Lisa discussed, the philosophy. What is philosophy? And I think that leads to a really important question about who is a philosopher. So I'm going to just cite a phrase that I use often when I'm teaching undergraduates who come to the 17th century for the first time. The past is a foreign country. They did things differently then. And the past of philosophy is they did things differently with respect to philosophy back then as well. And in some ways, this is just true of everybody writing at that time. Take the form of meditations. Very different from analytic philosophy as we know it today, even very different in some senses from continental philosophy as we know it today, a very, very particular kind of form in which philosophy was practiced, including practiced by one of the most well-known philosophers of the 17th century, Descartes. And so understanding that genre and the methods used, different methods used within different genre can articulate philosophical content in different ways, I think is really important as we read the past, as we read this period across the board. But what I want to focus on are women specifically and how women use different genres and different methods in order to negotiate their social situation. And in particular, I want to think about what we would nowadays call epistemic injustice. That is, the fact that women as knowers, that there were injustices visited upon women as knowers simply because of their identity as women. And there are a couple of ways in which this manifests itself, or that I talk about in the framing chapter that I wrote for the volume. And I'm going to talk about two other papers in the volume in bringing forward these two forms of epistemic injustice. So one of those forms, and this connects in with some comments Lisa just made, is the lack of really excellent education that many women during this period had. And consequently, the fact that they had to work hard to find ways of gaining that education. And sometimes, in fact, quite often, they were reliant upon visionary men in their lives to help them get that education. Emily du Châtelet picks this up in her discussion of translation. So this is the preface to her Fable of the Bees. A very, very short preface in which she provides some thoughts on the nature of translation that are extremely rich, and I think, in fact, carve out sort of a really interesting philosophy of translation. But what I want to focus on is what she says about women in translation. And specifically, she says many women, and she includes herself in this, even though I think her own writing that would follow demonstrates that that she's being far too modest with respect to herself. But many women can enter into intellectual activity not so much through their own original thoughts, but through translating other people's thoughts. And then she goes on to translate Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. But what she does in her translation is extraordinary. And that is that she adds stuff, she takes stuff out, she changes things, she uses very specific words that don't exactly capture Mandeville's original thinking, et cetera, et cetera. And in the process of doing that, she carves out what I take to be an original position on what has since been called the commerce and luxury debate. So that's a debate about whether or not pursuit of luxury as a private vice can be put to public good. And her translation of Mandeville is not so faithful. She herself says she's going to correct it philosophically along the way. And in the process of doing that, actually inserts far more of a thick ethical base to the debate. And a lot, and part of that ethical base is that the love that individuals have for each other in small family units actually blunts some of the more vice-filled elements of Mandeville's view. So both her theorizing about translation in that preface, but also her practice of translation in the text that follows, I think shows how what we would think of as not philosophy, translation is not original philosophy, actually can be original philosophy. In the volume, Corey Dick has a paper on German women philosophers. And much of what he discusses there is how their work as translators shifted the philosophical landscape in Germany at that time, given how the things that they chose to write about, the things that they brought into German philosophical consciousness that hadn't been part of the philosophical landscape before. And that's another way in which translation can actually have an impact on the nature of philosophy at a given time. A second way in which the women of this period suffered from epistemic injustice is in the lack of uptake of their original philosophical work. So this is something we would nowadays call testimonial injustice. That is, the testimony of women or the philosophical ideas of women are discounted simply because they are women. And you see acknowledgments of testimonial injustice, not termed that way, but clearly understood that way in many of the women of this period. Marie de Gournay has this really great line in which she says, you know, a really philosophically incompetent man can say something that's picked up as really, really valuable just because he's a man, and a woman can say the most brilliant thing, and that will not be picked up just because she's a woman. And that is quintessential testimonial injustice. And we see it in Cavendish as well. And one of the really interesting places in which Cavendish, she does it in a lot of her writing, but one of the really interesting places that she does it is in the prefaces to the texts that we would these days think of as pretty traditional philosophical treatises. Physical and philosophical opinions, for example, or grounds on natural philosophy, observations on experimental philosophy, these texts that are legible to us as contemporary philosophers because they are more like contemporary analytic philosophy. But in the prefaces, you get a lot of examining of the social context in which she produced her work. And a lot of discussion, autobiographical discussion about the struggle that she has to be heard as a woman. Discussion of the insidiousness of undermining women and women internalizing the belief that they are not legitimate knowers. What Ian Hacking in the 20th century would call the looping effect in the social construction of individuals. And how, as a result, women's words and women's ideas lose power even from the point of view of the women themselves. One of the most extraordinary examples of a preface that captures this phenomenon of testimonial injustice is the one written by her husband. So her husband writes a preface talking about how fantastic this work is, but that it was written by a man, that she chose a man to say that, was really, really, I think, clear example of, I want this work to be understood as great, but I can't say it and be taken seriously, but a man can say it, and then maybe it will be taken seriously. Another work in the volume that deals with this phenomenon, there are many, I think, but one that I just want to focus on is Margaret Watkins, who talks about Antoine Mo and Mary Estelle as writing behind the veil. And it's that, how do I write in order to be heard when I'm going to be discounted because of my identity? Just in interests of time, I'll talk just about Estelle because that's the character I know better in this domain. So Estelle wrote a Reflections upon Marriage, which is a difficult text to read if what you're reading for is precise and unambiguous argumentation. And the reason is because it is a highly sarcastic, highly ironic work. And it is written in that way in order to try and pull into the conversation people who are hostile to her ideas. So if she seems to be saying something that is that aligns with the views of folks who are hostile to women in marriage, then she can pull people into her ideas, and then they will perhaps see that actually she's arguing for she's arguing that men are often to blame for the destruction of marriage. But that's a case of writing behind the veil, finding a genre and a method, particularly the method of irony, the methods of irony and sarcasm, in order to try to overcome the fact that it's hard for her to be listened to. So, so that's my framing paper, and then a couple of comments about that. I think Lisa and I just want to conclude with a quick comment about the fact that there's so much more work to be done, and in some ways, I'm hopeful that our volume will continue to be a great resource, but in many ways, our volume has there's much work that's being done globally that is moved even further, and is moving rapidly the field even further. This conference is a perfect example of that, with the focus on Black Brazilian women philosophers. Super exciting to know how quickly the field is moving to become much more expansive, much more philosophically true, I think. I'll just pass it over to Lisa for final words.
Oh, Karen, those are such good words to end with. So I think I will just leave it there and just reiterate that, there's a lot of recognition of the work that's been just done over the past decades to really, I think, start the process of transforming the standards of practice in philosophy, to go back to the mission of the Extending New Narratives project. But I really just want to encourage people to continue the work and to keep the momentum, because there's a lot of work to do, but there is a lot more work to do, and I know a lot of really interesting work is happening right now in Brazil. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Liz and Karen. Do you have time for 2 questions, or Karen, you have to leave now? Yes? Okay. And I would like to make a question, and Sarah also. First of all, I recommend for the students, strongly recommend for the students here, the writings, Karen and Lisa's writings on philosophical canon, which is the basis of the reflections on the canon that we have been doing here in Brazil, and the chapters they wrote for this handbook. And my question is very simple, but it's important for us. We have been discussing this topic these days. The question is, we want to renew the canon because it is incomplete, but we don't want to destroy it. At least I don't want to, and I know that you both don't want to. And why? Why do we need a canon? I would like to know from you.
I'm going to leave that one to Lisa, who's thought so much about this.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I think one of the things, to go back to, I think one of the understanding of how the canon got constructed in the first place, the political considerations that are brought to bear, I think tells us that the positive role that a canon plays is creating a community, right? This is a shared set of texts that a group of people read and wrestle with, that inform their self-conceptions. And that's a very positive contribution. It's no accident that in France, there was lots of struggle, there still is struggle, about the national curriculum, and who should be in it and who should be not in it, because it's a way of forming a national identity, and that is a community identity. And so, that I think I would suggest that is of value, but that identity was formed in a particular time and place that was 200 years ago now, over 200 years ago now, and the world has evolved, things have changed. And so what we really need is a set of shared text, shared, maybe not so much shared text, but shared question. Well, there's lots of different ways to think about this. What we need is something that we share, right? That we can discuss with one another. There's two, I think, different dimensions to that. One is to think about what we share, a set of questions that we're all interested in exploring and addressing the answers to. And you can think about a shared set of questions and appeal to different text to anchor discussion about the answers to those questions. Or you can have in the background a set of texts that are something that is shared by many. And I actually think the right answer is somewhere kind of a combination of the two, that not everyone needs to read the texts I read, but they need to be willing to listen to me describe the text that I read and find out something about them. And by the same token, I don't need to read the text that other people are reading and finding meaningful around the same questions, but I need to be listening to what other people are looking at and reading and discussing, so that I can, bring those insights to bear on my own investigation. And then we're having a conversation with each other and bringing our different perspectives together. But the value of a canon is I think what a canon really brings to the fore is the fact that we need to share something, right? Like there's something that has to ground our shared conversation, but that we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we're using canonical texts to provide that focal point for discussion. That allows for a little bit of flexibility and contingency and dynamism to the text, while still preserving that core element of something that is shared. I don't know if that's helpful. If you want to add anything, Karen, I'll invite you to do that.
I agree with that, and I don't have anything really to add. I'm sorry.
Sara? Me ouve?
Yes, I'm very happy and delighted to be with you guys today. I would love to be in Brazil with you all, but I'm spending my time in Cambridge. So my question is really going to something that I'm going through here in Cambridge. I'm having the feeling that they are too Eurocentric. So I was very delighted to hear Lisa talking about how philosophy and their work as with this book is concerned with the historical context, that philosophy is not a thing that flies and is not connected with the earth. Like we have this context of colonization, imperialism, slavery, and all this money they are gaining from Latin America is being put in European universities and doing philosophy, and now they sell this philosophy for us as the philosophy. So it's a great thing to do in the effort to make this include the Latin America's thinkers we can think for ourselves. I think that's the challenge, and I would like to bring it up on our conversation. But my question is specifically, how do you think that bringing no male and no white people to philosophical canon complexify the philosophy itself, complexify the way we do philosophy nowadays? I don't know if I think I make myself clear.
I'll try to answer in a way that let me know if I've missed your point. I do just want to say there's a bit of feedback. I'm wondering if we're all on mute. Sarah, are you back on mute? Okay, thank you. I just want to make a comment about the first thing you said, which is the extraordinary importance of community in this, and a really, really robust community of people who can interact and support and tell each other this is important work, and you're not really out of step for wanting to do it, or if you're out of step, it doesn't mean that you're out of step for reasons that are that for bad reasons, right? You're out of step for good reasons, and this, I think, that the idea of really having a strong community, global community, community across generations is central to any kind of recovery project, including this project. So I want to go back to something that Lisa said, and Sarah, tell me if this gets to the core of your question, and that is that, you know, philosophy has often been sort of characterized as this transcendent project that looks at eternal questions for which there are eternal truths, etc. But the importance of lived experience and what it feels like to be a person in a certain context is at least as central, probably more central to the practice of philosophy, and the kinds of questions we ask, the ways in which we think about the answers, why we think it's important to ask the questions, etc. And the degree to which we are thinking about the lived experiences of people who are not white, not male, is the degree to which we are thinking about philosophical questions much, much more expansively, and the answers to those questions much, much more expansively. You know, I think there's plenty of empirical evidence that in any in areas of inquiry, it's really important to get strong diversity of points of view in order to get better answers to an area of inquiry. And I think that this is true in philosophy as well. To get a better philosophy, we have to have much broader range of perspectives than historically we have entertained, at least within the Western Academy, and understand the answers that people have given to understand the questions people have asked and the answers that people have given because of their perspectives, and that the questions matter in some very, very important way to them, and the answers are reflections of lived experience. Sarah, have I answered your question?
Yeah, I'm wondering actually. I think we have a lot of challenges, especially in Brazil, being the country who writes in a Portuguese language, and as far as I'm concerned, we have not so much connection with Portugal as a country to change perspectives, because being a Portuguese speakers. So I think the most challenge now is to try to translate our work, as Natasha Pugliese is doing with Nisia Floresta, for example, and to bring like our thinkers to the global north. Maybe I think that's the challenge for us, and I think that's something we can discuss in Unicamp and in Brazil broadly with other colleagues. But I'm after my experience here in Cambridge, I think I'm going back to Brazil really more willing to make this happen, because I'm really bothered and sometimes angry how much Eurocentric we are, and we talk, and especially here, maybe in other countries, especially US, that I have another experience, they are more concerned with another thinkers. And it's not related to your work, because you make very clear in the introduction that it's about European and a piece of a piece of time and a piece of geography. But I think it's a challenge for the further works to try to bring it up, these other voices, and make more diverse. And I think Lisa in her chapter says something about philosophy is a humanist inquiry that facilitates our understandings of ourselves. So I think it's a good thing to try to understand I think it's a very old discussion in Brazil. It's Brazilian has a philosophy or not, but especially if we can understand ourselves as women, as Latin women in Latin America, women, and trying to bring this to discussion more and make more diversity. Sorry, I talked too much, but thank you.
Can I want to say something. I think you're making a great point, Sarah. And I also think, I don't know very much about the history of Brazilian philosophy, or Latin American philosophy for that matter. But I think one of the really interesting things about figures like Nícia Floresta is that there's this history of the communication of European ideas into Latin America. Nícia traveled to Europe, read European philosophy, and then brought it back to the Brazilian context and relaunched the philosophical ideas as tailored to that context. And that's fascinating, just from an intellectual historical point of view. And I think it really kind of is a real case to illustrate what I think that you're saying, right? That and Europeans, North Americans, we're not always cognizant of this, the way in which ideas get transmitted and developed into different contexts, and making it's a really important insight to recognize that you can have an idea that was meaningful to someone, but not in this abstract way that allowed them to come back to their homeland and to repurpose those ideas in new and interesting ways that transform them in important ways. And having that be part of our histories of philosophy is, I think will be really central. I'm sure there's stories to tell about transmission of African philosophies into Europe, or Chinese philosophies into Europe and into North America, right? Like there's a lot of cross-pollination that happens. And I know there's folks globally working on that dimension of thinking about global philosophy. So yeah, so yes to what you said, but that's a kind of way of really honing and illustrating with an example from the past, as well as your own experience coming back from Cambridge to Brazil. So
I'm afraid that we have to finish because Karen has an appointment now. So thank you very much, Karen and Lisa. It would be great to translate the book into Portuguese.
Yes. You don't want to do that. It's a lot of work. It's a big fat book. But thank you. So, I'll say thank you for the invitation and this opportunity, and happy to just wish we were in Brazil with you, quite frankly. It would be nice to be in person, having discussions after this and not having a meeting to go to afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful hour and a half to steal me for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah.
Sarah.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao. Cadê a Sarah? Foi embora? Ótimo. E agora a gente vai almoçar, né?